Good afternoon and good morning, everybody, depending on where you live. My name is Maggie Bush. I'm the Programs and Outreach Director at LWVUS and the manager of our Youth Voter Registration Grant Program. As hopefully you heard the announcement just now, everybody's lines will be muted for now, just to keep background noise to a minimum. But we will have the opportunity to open up the lines at a few points throughout the next 45 minutes or so to chat and share some thoughts. So if you have a question, you can type it into the question box, and I will get to those as I'm able to while walking through the training and the webinar today. So let's go ahead and get started. And this is being recorded, so if you have to step away or don't catch something, don't worry, we're going to send out the PowerPoint, the recording, and some other materials after the call today. So today we're going to cover the basics of how our grant program works for those of you who are new. We'll spend some time on some high school, in particular high school voter registration best practices and youth voter registration best practices in general. We'll, as I said, have some time to share with one another about what's working really well for you, and then of course ask some questions, talk about the resources that we have available beyond the grant funding to make sure that you all are as successful as possible this year. So about our youth voter registration program, many of you have received grants from us before and are familiar with this, so a lot of the information you hear today might be a review of things you've heard in past years. Many of you are also brand new. We've been running this program out of the national office since 2010. It's one of a few of our real core voter registration programs, and we'll talk about why it's so important and why youth voter registration is so important in a few minutes. We are thrilled to have been able to provide hundreds of grants to local leagues, dozens of leagues across many, many states since 2010 through this program. I've been the manager of this program since then, so I've had the unique opportunity to work with hundreds of league volunteers on this program and learn from you all about what's really working well as you engage young voters in your community. Collectively, the grantees as part of this program have registered many, many thousands of voters, and of course that will continue this year. We have a great training manual that leagues participating in this program have helped contribute to and improve over the years. Hopefully you've taken a look at that manual already. If not, we'll be sending it out after today's webinar, and we are always looking for ways to improve upon that and make it easier and more helpful for league volunteers to use. That manual and that program has been recognized by former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder at our convention several years back. It's been recognized and shared as a great resource by the National Teaching for Democracy Collaborative of organizations and many, many other partners. And of course, it's used widely throughout the league by leagues who are participating in our grant project and those who are not, but just want some best practices for engaging young voters. This year, we have our biggest ever grantee class, and I'm so excited by that. We have the opportunity to support more leagues than ever before through the grant program. We have 38 grantee leagues, which is why we had to have 3 different training times, because there are so many of you participating this year. Together, you all are planning to reach more than 400 schools over the next 6 months or so, and conduct voter registration. So this hopefully will be our biggest year ever. I'm so excited by that. And as I said, excited to be working with many of you who are brand new to our program and getting to know you as you work, and getting the opportunity to connect with leagues that have been part of the program for a long time. So why the league matters first. And you all, of course, have great reasons why the league matters, I'm sure. But in terms of our voter registration work, the league matters because groups like the league, what we would call third-party or independent voter registration groups, register millions and millions of voters every year, far beyond just what elections officials are able to do or what voters on their own are doing. We're especially critical in reaching underrepresented groups. And of course, young people would be considered an underrepresented group of voters. We know that the social interaction alone of asking someone to become a voter, especially with young voters, especially in what we call off-year elections or with the upcoming midterm elections, asking someone to become a voter, making that personal connection and ask is especially positive, and especially so among groups of voters who are less likely to participate. So young people being, of course, a key group of that. In terms of young voters, we also know that there's a confidence gap. So young voters are more likely to cite that not knowing how the voting process works, not knowing how to get registered, not knowing when a registration deadline is happening, not knowing who's on the ballot. All of these things can contribute to somebody not voting. So young people, if they feel that they don't know enough to vote or don't have the resources to access the information they need to get registered or to vote, are much more likely to stay home. That's especially, again, true in non-presidential election years. So again, our role is that much more critical in reaching young people. And of course, we know that those underrepresented groups, in this case, young people, help us get the biggest bang for our buck and our very limited resources as an organization. If we can go to a high school, and many of you have done this, and register dozens or hundreds even of people in a single day, that is a huge, huge return on our investment of getting volunteers to that school, of printing all the materials, of organizing all of the logistics. This is hard work that we're doing. And so if we can have that result of not only improving our democracy by getting lots and lots of young people registered, but having a good outcome for our own self and our own volunteers and making our investments worthy of it, that's a win-win-win for everybody involved. So those are just some of the reasons why we really are focused on young people. Again, you probably have your own reasons as well. In terms of why high schools and community colleges and technical schools specifically, of course, we know we have an increasingly influential millennial population who will soon outweigh other age groups of voters and become more and more politically critical in the years to come. And of course, they and the younger generations will become the recipients of policy decisions being made by our leaders today. Of course, unfortunately, as most of you know, only about 50% of today's 18-year-olds are registered to vote. And that's because they're not being asked. They're not being given that opportunity. We know that underrepresentation in registration first and then in voting itself grows greatly when you look at folks who don't go on to college, folks in communities of color, folks in low-income communities, et cetera. So high schools and community colleges are our prime opportunity to reach those communities now and really focus our efforts. The League is often the only organization granted access to public schools, for example, because of our strong reputation, because of our, just lost my slide. Because of our strong reputation, because of our strong ties in the community, and we are trusted. Many of you have long-standing ties to the schools in your community and are absolutely trusted to go in and teach young people about democracy and equip them with voter registration help. We also know that many, many organizations already operate on traditional four-year university campuses. Not to say that students on four-year campuses don't need voter registration help, but there tend to be more opportunities for four-year university students to be asked to register to vote than, for example, in high schools or in community colleges or technical schools, vocational schools, and that sort of thing. So again, that's why you see us specifically focusing in on those kinds of venues for this program. Now, voter registration gaps. This is a little bit outdated at this point, but this will show you, and some of you have seen these slides before, just how great the registration gaps are in different communities. So clearly on the first graph, the orange graph shows age. You can see the 18 to 24 population registering and thus voting at significantly lower rates than older populations. And then of course, on the green side here, we see data around communities of color versus white voters and the registration gaps that exist. Again, this is based on Census Bureau. It's a bit outdated at this point. And all of this, of course, differs depending on what state you live in. Despite those gaps, we know that young people feel empowered. Certainly the last year of political action in this country shows that young people, and in particular young women, feel empowered to take action. People want to take action. 75% of millennials believe voting is a way to have an impact on issues they care about. And so to help address the gap, 75% of millennials believe this, and yet only 50% of 18-year-olds are registered to vote, give or take. We have a key role to play in helping bridge that gap and helping provide the hands-on assistance that young people need to get registered and be confident about voting and successfully make it to the polls, not only in 2018, but of course, in 2020 and for the rest of their lives. Now, to quickly go over the grant project basics, and then we'll get into the fun stuff in just a minute. Here are the real basics. Having worked with hundreds of league teams, you all have very different approaches for what you do, what works well for you. You know better than I or than another league in another part of the country. Everyone has their own ways of doing things. What we've tried to put together here are some of the overall best practices that I hear over and over again from leagues about what's working. By and large, the number one thing I hear is we need lots and lots of time to contact the schools and get things set up. Many leagues, if they don't have the time they need to do that, tend to get a real crunch at the end of the year or run out of time to even go into a school. So if you haven't already started reaching out to schools to schedule your registration drives, especially if you're new to this work or working with a new school this year that you've never worked with before, this is the time to do it. Our training manual has some great words of advice specifically on this because it's such a challenge for many leagues. And I'm always also happy to provide one-on-one help and troubleshooting if this is something you're having a challenge with. So leave lots of time, start that outreach now, train your team so that any volunteer working with us going into schools has the basis of understanding about what we're doing, why it's so important, and things to be aware of. We'll talk about things to talk about with your team of volunteers in just a minute. I want to encourage everyone to aim to reach as many students as possible. So a very common thing we hear, just as an example, from schools and that I hear from leagues is, oh, sure, we'd love to have you come speak to our school, but we only think that the honors students would be interested in voting. So we'll just schedule the league to come talk to the honors government class or the AP social studies class. We don't want to only talk to the honors students or the people on the certain block scheduling or the affluent school in town. We want to talk to as many schools as possible, and you've already identified who those are for the most part. We want to access as many students as possible, whether it's visiting multiple classrooms, making sure if they have block scheduling, for example, maybe we can go on 2 different days. To reach, every eligible senior, every eligible voter as we possibly can. So we don't leave any young people behind. Incorporating students in the voter registration itself, whether it's through a little back and forth in your classroom conversation, and we'll talk about a few ideas for doing that, or having even a formal relationship with a group of students, which many of you have done one way or the other, can really help increase the number of people you're registering and increase your long-standing ties to a school, meaning that you'll be even more successful the next time you do this. And then finally, keep it brief. In the schools, students and teachers are incredibly busy. They may only be able to give you 5 minutes. If that's the case, then that's what you make work. So keeping our talks to students brief and interesting and engaging Focus on the voting as the #1 goal and the registration. And then, of course, following up with voters after the point of registration so that we can actually encourage them to turn out to vote for the first time this year, and then, of course, for the long term. And we'll spend some time on that in a few minutes here. So it hopefully for many of you goes without saying, but for those of us who are new or who are working with brand new volunteers, knowing the rules is incredibly important. And I know many, many of you have gotten lots of new volunteers over the last year or so with a particular interest in voter registration. Lots of people have flocked to our organization given the current political climate in our country, and people by and large say they want to do something. People feel great about getting involved in our voter registration work, but they may not have ever done it before. So making sure that any volunteer who's working with us on voter registration at least has a basic understanding of the rules, or certainly that at any voter registration drive in a school, at least one of your volunteers is well-versed on how the league does its work and what the rules are governing voter registration in your state, in your community. Local elections officials, of course, who many of you have great relationships with, are a wonderful source of information about any rules governing voter registration, any trainings you may need to attend or that are voluntarily available to you. I will be that resource for you here at LWVUS. I'm always happy to talk through any challenge you have, help make sure you understand the rules. If there's a question about what you're doing, your state league as well can be very helpful. Many of your state leagues do training on voter registration and how that works in your state, and are doing a great job of equipping local leagues with that information. Our partners at the Fair Elections Legal Network also have some great resources about how voter registration drives are governed at the state level, if there are any rules or regulations that you should be aware of, and we'll send around a link to those guides after the call today. Now, working with elections officials, again, many of you are doing this already on a yearly or year-round basis. Here are just a few tips that we suggest. Tell the elections officials in your area what you're planning to do. Hey, we're planning to visit these 6 schools roughly on this timeline. Here's when we're hopefully going to be coming by your office with lots and lots of voter registration forms filled out. It's great to give them that heads up. Again, attend any trainings that they're offering, even if they're not required. See what kinds of materials they may have available. Maybe they have stickers available. Those are a big exciting thing for voters of all ages, of course. Or maybe they have information about the schedule for elections and primaries this year, or even sample ballots once we get closer to primary and general election time. It's important to communicate with them, turn in the forms promptly after you do a voter registration drive. Some of you live in states where there's even a required time window to turn in forms. Make sure you're aware of that and all your volunteers are aware of that and that you're, of course, abiding by that. Even if there is not a requirement, we recommend turning in the forms very promptly and flagging any applications, any voter registration applications for the officials that there may be an issue with. So maybe you notice after the busy day that a student forgot to sign their voter registration form or that some of the required fields were not filled out properly or completely. It's good to pull that application to the top of the pile, point it out to the election official, say, hey, we noticed this. Is there anything we can do as the league to help make sure this voter gets successfully onto the rolls? Can we follow up with you to offer our help, or just at least alert them to the fact? We want to make sure that those students have a good experience and, of course, get registered. Now, working with allies, and I'm going to ask you in a minute to tell us who you're working with in terms of partners. So get ready and think about this. Many of you work with lots and lots of partners to do your youth voter registration. And in terms of if you're thinking about who you might partner with, and some of you have already figured this all out, of course, because you're already getting to work in your schools. But here are a few things to really think about with new and longstanding partners. Who can really help us tap into new communities? Is there a partner in the community that, because you may not be able to partner with everyone who's interested, right? we may have to make some tough choices about who to partner with, or for example, it might be time to move on from a longstanding partner and try to work with somebody new, and that comes with challenges. But who can really help us tap into new communities? Is there a grouping of schools that you've never been able to successfully schedule registration events with? Is there a student group at the schools who you think might help you tap into more students or have a higher rate of registration when you go into the schools? What are the specific tasks that we could give to a partner group or that they may ask us to do? So being really clear ahead of time about what is the league going to do versus the partner group, and how are you gonna separate the work? Can they provide volunteers? If they are providing volunteers, are we being just as welcoming as possible? Are we really towing that line between doing things, quote unquote, the league way, running our voter registration the way that we like to do it and know how to, in a way that's also very welcoming to our partners, and thanking those partners and the volunteers that they supply? How are we talking about our partnership in public? Are we receiving proper credit for all the work we're doing? Are we giving that to our partner? These are some of the key challenges that tend to come up. Partnership work is tricky, but incredibly important in our voter registration work, especially with young people. And so these are some of the things to think about. The manual, the training manual, has some more partnership kind of troubleshooting guides in it. And again, I'm always very happy to help brainstorm and work through some of that on an individual basis anytime there's a challenge. I work with a lot of our partners at the national level and know that it's tricky work, but vitally important to our success. So happy to be a sounding board for you with that. So like I said, I'd like to open up the phones now and ask you, just if you'd like to share briefly, who are you working with in your school outreach this year? So are you working with a student group or another community group that's been really particularly helpful for you? You can either enter it into the question bar, or next to your name, you can raise your hand. There's a little hand icon if you'd like to speak. And if you raise your hand, I will unmute your line and give you a minute to talk. All right, Eileen in Pittsburgh. We should be able to hear you, Eileen. Tell us who you're working with.
Yeah, well, we're working with Inspire US, which will be a first time with us. They do a lot of high school registration, but they're doing it all across the whole state, so they can't cover all of the high schools that we can. And we just found out about a new organization in a minority section of town called VEEM, Voter Empowerment, Education, Enrichment, and Movement. And one of our members has just joined their board. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to, this is in the African American community, so I hope we'll be able to collaborate with them and help them out and do what they're trying to, in doing what they're trying to do. Maybe doing some training with them, or I don't quite know what that's going to look like. And we're also working with one of the deans at our community college system to get in there.
Great. Wow, that sounds like a lot of things, Eileen. So to your the first mention of Inspire US, that's a group that I know Don's on the line from Arlington, and maybe others of you are also working with Inspire folks. They are an organization working across several states, and they actually comprise student-led teams who are working in their schools and in area schools. And I know that for many of leagues, it's been a great partnership to be part of, kind of coupling the league's expertise with young people actually talking about voting to their peers. And so that's been a great experience, and glad to hear you're trying that out in Pittsburgh. And and I know other leagues, as I said, are working with the Inspire groups in the states where they're active. So that's great. Thank you, Eileen. Carol, Neal, I'm gonna unmute your line.
Thank you.
Hi, Carol, go ahead.
Hi. Well, I'm in Wichita, Kansas, and we have a relationship with the Retired Teachers Association. and the teachers union. And both of them are very committed to working on, getting high school students registered. And Wichita Area Technical School or College, which has 4 campuses, we work with them directly through their event planner. And hopefully this year we'll be able to get into their into the classroom instead of just into the facility. And as we're working with a couple of two groups, a Hispanic group, the gentleman actually publishes the Hispanic newspaper and is very committed to the Hispanic community. And with them, we have a group of volunteers that both speak Spanish and are just available to us for whatever. And then in the African American community, we have 3 African American women that are on our board. So they're trying to work with some of the youth organizations there to help us.
Wonderful. Wow. Well, Carol, that's a lot of great partners that you're working with, representing a whole wide range of course, of audiences and communities. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Carol. And several of you put things in the chat box. I'm just going to read what a few of you said. Bet said they're working with the NAACP youth group, so reaching, again, African American young folks. Mary said they're working with sorority Delta Sigma Theta. That's, many leagues work with sororities at the local level to help make connections and get volunteers. Gail says they're working with a minority youth group called Club Stride. Fran in Lancaster, again, mentions the Inspire US group that we heard about from Eileen, and as well as the Campus Election Engagement Project, which is a national group that some of you may have worked with before. Marilou in Los Angeles has lots of folks they're working with. Let's see, the Families in Schools, Why Vote, the Secretary of State, and Telemundo. Excellent. That's really exciting to hear, Marilou. And then let's see, the Junior League, Mary says, in Columbus, Ohio, for volunteers. Yep, many of our leagues work with junior leagues to help get volunteers, and this is the kind of project that junior league folks love to get involved with. And then recruiting retired elected officials from both parties. That's great. Very exciting, Mary. Gail said setting up some collaborations with Black Women for Political Action, and we'll be doing some training with those folks so that they can successfully work with the leagues in the classrooms to help get into some more high schools, as well as working with the voter registration folks with your local officials and schools. That's great. Joyce in Texas, working with a whole bunch of groups, including the NAACP, student group for the Austin Community College system, a regional Hispanic group, as well as some retired teachers, like Carol mentioned in Wichita. And then let's see, a few more. Let's see. Oh, Hope wondered, are we going to get a copy of this PowerPoint? Yes, Hope, you will get a PowerPoint, and we'll be sending around a recording and the training manual as well. Thanks for asking. And then let's see. Oh, we have a great question from South Carolina where there might be some reluctance to let the league into some schools, and we will talk about that. The training manual actually has a ton of helpful information and even a sample letter, Dorothy, for doing that. So that's a great question that we do hear comes up a lot. So, all right, well, that's some great partners that you all are working with. Thank you for sharing. That's really, hopefully gave some of your colleagues some ideas of places you might reach out to some new partners. So I want to keep things moving. I know some of you are joining us on your limited lunch hour, etc. So team planning, many of you, again, are already doing this or have already started. But here are, and not to overwhelm you, but here are some of the things to be thinking about. And again, we'll send this PowerPoint out, so no need to write this all down, but someone needs to be in charge on your team of recruiting the volunteers. And luckily, the youth voter registration is a project that many people are really excited to do, but it can still be a challenge to recruit volunteers. So just like calling the schools, that's something that should start as soon as possible. It is great to give volunteers, especially new volunteers, bite-sized, very specific, concrete tasks to do. So I know my own league, the Arlington, Virginia League, has done a great job of splitting up voter registration shifts and allowing people through an online sign-up process to pick the 1 or 2 shifts that they can take at a specific school and commit to that, and then get email confirmation and so forth. And that has made it much easier for people like me who are, juggling lots of things to sign up and participate in when they need volunteers. So however you're recruiting volunteers, making it bite-sized, not asking someone necessarily to commit to 3 whole days of voter registration drives in the schools, but for 2 hours here, 2 hours on this day, et cetera, can be very helpful if you're struggling to get enough volunteers. Who's going to be the main liaison with the partners that you all have just told us about? Who's touching base with elections officials? Who, of course, is contacting the venues? So actually being the point person with the schools. Hopefully it's not just one person doing all this, by the way. Hopefully you're helping split this up among a few people. And again, if you need help figuring out that challenge, I'm always happy to help brainstorm how you can make that a little bit easier if you're struggling or if it all seems to be falling just on your shoulders. Who's going to communicate with the community about what you're doing? So hopefully you're letting the media in your community know what you're doing and sending out a press release. And we have a sample that makes it really easy for you to do that, by the way. Who's letting your partners know? Who's making sure a little blurb goes in the newsletter about this great work or on Facebook? Who is going to, at the actual school events, who's going to do the talking? And how are we picking that person to make sure it's somebody who is positive about voting and exciting to listen to and can talk with young people in an effective way? Who is making sure those forms, those completed voter registration forms, get turned into the officials? And then finally, who's in charge of figuring out how you're going to follow up with the new voters after the event? And again, how you all are doing that, you already have some really great organized plans for how you'll do that, how you'll collect contact information from your voters and follow up with them. And we're going to spend some time on that in a minute as well. I said before that a team training is really great, even if it's just a 5-minute huddle before you walk into a classroom for the first time, or even better, if you do a training before you get started altogether. Here are some of the key things that I hear over and over from leagues. First of all, walking through the voter registration form, or if you're using an online voter registration process in your state, using that at the schools, walking through how that works, making sure that your volunteers are really clear on how that should work. Any volunteer going and doing this work should know, if you're using paper forms, what are the required fields on that form and how to answer basic questions that students might have. Some of you, if you've never done this before, may be surprised by how many questions young people have about filling out a government form. I know I myself have been surprised by the questions I've gotten. Young people are not filling out government forms day in and day out. They don't know their social security number off the top of their head the way that you or I do. For example, if that's required on your form, they will have questions. And so making sure your volunteers are really clear on how the form works, really clear on how the online process works. For example, if you live in a state that has online voter registration, yet you must have a valid driver's license in order to use that online voter registration system, your volunteers need to be really clear on how that works and what they can offer to students, of whom there are many, who don't have a driver's license. So making sure that you know in that situation to supply a paper form to that student, or however you've worked it out. Again, you, if you're the leader of your effort for your league, probably are really clear on all this, but not every volunteer can be expected to know the ins and outs of all this. These are the important points to hit ahead of time so that volunteers are confident, have the easy, quick answers to questions, and that we're all being consistent in how we answer questions that new voters ask us. And then finally, focusing on eligibility requirements. So being really clear on how the age requirement works in your state. Some of you have to be 18 just to register, period. Some states, students can be 17 as long as they'll be 18 by election day. Some states are now allowing 17-year-olds to vote in primaries if they'll be 18 by the general election. So again, just knowing how that works in your state and having a simple way of explaining that to the young people that you talk with so that they know exactly what to do as they're filling out that registration form. And then finally, the best thing to practice with your team is your actual registration pitch, whether you'll be standing in front of a classroom or standing behind a table at the cafeteria or the hallway as people come and go. It's really important to practice. I know every time I go out and do this, I practice in front of the mirror or practice in front of my husband ahead of time. And I feel a little silly doing that, but you get a little rusty if you haven't done it in a year or more. So practicing what you're going to say to the young people, practicing with a team member, how you're going to talk about voting. First of all, we have to keep it positive and enthusiastic. Even in today's political environment, it's easy to think that appealing to anger and frustration is the way to go. But really what the polling tells us over and over and over again is that we should talk about voting in an empowering and positive way. So even if the frame is, if you don't like the direction our country is headed, your vote can make a difference. Just turning it, even if you talk about it in a nonpartisan but sort of slightly alarming tone, turning it to positive and enthusiastic. We know that when voters hear that they can make a difference, when they understand exactly why their vote matters, and this is especially important in midterm elections, when they're electing people who are going to make incredibly important decisions that affect their lives. The people that we elect to local government, to statewide office, to represent us in Congress, are certainly making really important decisions every single day that affect our lives. And so helping make that connection for young people, helping talk about the fact that if you have a governor's race in your state this year, that governor and the people that work for him or her are going to have an enormous influence on how healthcare works in your state and the job opportunities that come to your state, how the college system is run in your state, all things that matter greatly to the young people that you're talking with. Helping connect those dots, especially among, again, those lesser known political offices that people don't tend to understand as much what those leaders do for us, can really be helpful. And again, just asking people to become voters. So practicing out loud how you'll talk about that really does help. And again, walking through the kinds of questions you think you might get from the voters can really help everyone just feel more confident and positive going into it. Now, again, we've already kind of talked about a lot of these things, but at the event, again, whether you're in classrooms or setting up tables in a school, we have found that classrooms tend to be more successful. That personal touch of really being able to spend time with students, walk from desk to desk as they're filling out the forms, was found to be far more effective than other approaches to doing high school registration. But we do understand that many of you kind of take what you can get from the schools in terms of where you set up. And many of you have found that it works really well to do however you're setting things up. But if you have the opportunity to visit individual classes, that has shown to be really effective for most leagues who do it. But regardless of how you're setting up, be sure to have volunteers who can walk the room. So get out from behind that table, be friendly, smile. I don't mean to sound condescending, but I've certainly seen league voter registration tables where two people are sitting behind a table, maybe just talking to one another and not looking out, or asking people to come over to the table, or these days, of course, potentially sitting there looking at their smartphone as opposed to trying to engage with the people in the school. So certainly smiling, being welcoming, make the most of your time in these schools, and that really does make a huge difference. Being positive and smiling, students might be intimidated to walk up. They've never registered to vote before. They don't know what this is all about. They don't know how the form works. All of these things are just, remember that this is intimidating maybe for young people. So make it easy for them to want to get your help. Always bring one more volunteer than you think you need. Again, many of you are now at the point where you're considering whether using your state's online voter registration portal, if your state has it, is helpful or not. Sometimes it's not. So if you're not in a place that can get a stable Wi-Fi signal, or in a place where all students have easy access to devices, moving online for high schools and community colleges may not actually be logistically what makes sense right now. You might still be more time efficient using paper forms for now. And our training manual has some things to think through. And again, I'm always happy to help talk through what has worked for other leagues on an individual basis if you need help there. Now, we're gonna, again, open up the phone lines in a minute and get tips from you, but here are some of the things that have worked really well for leagues when they walk into a classroom and all of a sudden have to be inspiring to young people all of a sudden about registering and voting. So here are a few things that we have found works really well, and things that I've tried myself, and I know that many of you have tried as well. First, again, whether it's someone coming up to your table or you opening up a quick talk to a classroom full of students, it helps to ask questions. So, what are they covering in class this week? Whether it's a social studies class or an algebra class, what are they talking about? How was spring break? What's going on with the football team? Anything to kind of familiarize yourself with the room, be friendly, again, kind of break that ice. It's really helpful to ask, has anyone in the room registered or voted before? Usually at least one person has, even if it's the teacher. And that can be a really great way to start to break the ice and talk about voting. So, oh, you sitting here, so you say you've registered to vote? Why did you do that? When did you do that? And, more often than not, someone will raise their hand and have a story to tell. Sometimes they'll say, well, my mom wanted me to do it, or I registered when I got my driver's license, or I voted in last year's election because it was really important to me. Hopefully that kind of question can get a conversation going. In terms of making that connection really personal to the folks in the room about why voting matters, again, we talked about some of those things. School day length, jobs, affording college, whatever is in the news. Dreamers, of course, many students in the schools you're working with know undocumented young people. Clearly that's top of mind for many young people right now. Or, what kind of job opportunities they're going to have when they graduate, or whatever the issue is that's going on locally or at the national level, but better yet, locally, that matters in your community, and tying that to why voting is so important. The people we're electing this year are going to have huge sway over how these decisions play out and how these policies get made for us, and it's going to affect all of our lives. And that's why your vote is just as important as mine, and just as important as your parents and your teachers and everybody else in our community. And then clearly, of course, again, in a nonpartisan way, people understand the critical nature of these elections this year. And it's important for us to underscore that. And again, to invite the young people we interact with to be part of it, to be part of deciding our country's future. Now, this is a quick activity. And again, after this, we'll open up the phone lines. This is a quick activity that we cover in the training manual, and that many of you have tried, different variations of this. This can do a really quick, easy visual for young people about how much they matter, and underscoring that many young people don't vote. So you can start by asking everyone to stand up, and then ask every other row or every other person to sit down. So those who sat down are representing the roughly 50% or so of 18-year-olds who aren't registered. So only the folks remaining standing are speaking for everybody else in the classroom, right? And then of those still standing, you can ask about a quarter of them to sit down, whether it's 1 out of 4 rows or however it makes sense to break that up. Those folks who just sat down represent those who got registered but didn't vote. So again, when you're left in the end, you're left with a very small group of students still standing. They're the only ones that have a say for the entire class. Does that seem fair to everybody sitting down? Of course not. We don't want only a few people deciding everybody's future. And that's why we want everyone to register and vote today. So I know that a lot of you have had fun doing this. And again, it's a really quick 20-second way to underscore the importance of voting. All right, so now I want to hear from all of you again about what other things are you doing to break the ice in a classroom? What have you found to be really successful when you start kind of talking with a group of students? Mary, I'm going to unmute your line. Go ahead, Mary.
I think mine was on by mistake. I'm sorry.
Oh, all right, Mary. Well, we'll come back to you if you think of something. Thank you. Okay, anybody else? What are you doing to break the ice when you go into a group of students? All right, I'm going to look in the question box. All right, so Gail says that using a PowerPoint in the presentation helps the students and helps you stay focused. Yes, that's a win-win, Gail. If you have the access to the technology, using a PowerPoint, especially with maybe some multimedia of some sort, can be a great quick way of keeping organized. And Gail says, yes, you really like the stand-up, sit-down activity. That's great. And you say, you often tell your story of registering to vote and how you could not vote when you were 18. You're right. So many of us, one way or another, represent communities that have traditionally been left out of the voting process. Whether we couldn't register to vote when we were 18 because of that amendment, or we are ourselves from a community of color who couldn't vote, or we were an immigrant who couldn't vote in this country until we went through the naturalization process. Many of us have a story to tell. So even if none of the students has registered or voted, maybe you or one of your volunteers has a great story to tell. Great. Okay, Margaret, you hit the nail on the head. Draw them in with food. You have a healthy snacks. That kudos to you. You're bringing apples and granola bars. A lot of leagues bring candy. Whatever works. But snacks, trinkets, little prizes. The only caveat with anything like that is any giveaway you're bringing just needs to be available to anybody, whether or not they fill out a voter registration form. So that's just because of some legal guidelines in some states, it's our recommendation that if you're bringing snacks or little prizes or whatever, just make sure that can be available to any student, and so it's not seen as a quid pro quo for registering. But yes, snacks are great. Fran, they're giving away student memberships to the league. That's wonderful. That's great. Yeah. Okay. So Linda is talking about being old enough to fight in war, but not old enough to vote from your coming of age during the Vietnam War, and when that amendment was made to the Constitution to lower the voting age. Again, telling that personal story, seeing your peers go off to war but not be able to stand up and vote. That's really, really important. Yeah, that's really powerful. Thanks, Linda. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone who shared. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I guess no one wants to share verbally what they're doing to break the ice, but many of you shared some really great ideas in the chat, so thank you. I'm going to move on in the interest of time, and I saw there were a couple more questions that I will get to back there in a minute. Now, the important topic of how are we following up with the young people after registration to help get out the vote. And I know this is something that leagues, your league may be new to this. Many of you have already asked me if you had questions about this. We've talked about it on an individual basis. And you all are figuring out what works best for you in with your league, with any state laws that exist for your state. And again, I'm always happy to help work that out or help explain to members of your league team why this is so important, why it's a requirement of any grant we give out. But here are some of the main reasons why we require you to follow up with the young people that you're registering. It helps empower us to remind new registrants to vote and share the great information we are already doing as a league. So many, many, many of you or your other league peers are spending countless hours hosting debates, compiling voters' guides on Vote 411, putting together sample ballots, putting together great resources, and you need an audience of voters to share it with. So guess what? When you're going into classrooms and interacting with hundreds of students, those are the people who need our great information, who can best benefit from our voters' guides, who need help understanding where their polling place is, when election day is coming, how the voting process works, do they need to bring ID on election day, what kinds of ID are accepted, all of those things that your league is already working hard to get out the word about need to get into the hands of voters. And so by simply collecting a little bit of contact information from the people we register, we have a built-in audience for our great work. It also helps us troubleshoot any issues that come up. If a voter registration form doesn't get handled properly for whatever reason, and a student is calling you saying, hey, you helped me register to vote, I don't seem to be on the list, or I never got my voter registration card in the mail, or God forbid I showed up to vote on election day and was told I'm not registered, what happened? Having a record of when we registered somebody, having their information can help avoid that kind of situation in the first place, of course, but then also troubleshoot after the fact should we need to help advocate for a voter if there's some issue. It helps protect the league by having those good records. It helps tap us into potential new volunteers and members, as a few of you pointed out. And frankly, it's the best practice that every other organization out there doing voter registration, every foundation funder funding our work so that we can make these grants possible, simply expects and requires, because everybody knows that follow-up is so important. Voters need to hear about 3 times from us to get the message about get out the vote, about election day. Just because you and I know when every primary and general election date is coming up this year in our community and exactly who's on the ballot and what that office does, doesn't mean the young people that we're reaching know that information or have easy access to find it. So we can help supply that to them and make sure that they're not just registering to vote with us, they're becoming lifelong voters. So many of you are logistically doing this, as I said, in different ways and have already figured this out, but here are the ways that some of the leagues are doing it. One really easy way is to simply create a database in Excel or some other way directly from the voter registration form. Again, there may be requirements in your state about what information you're allowed to collect or some other guidelines governing this. I'm always happy to answer questions about that or help you figure it out. We recommend you only collect the information that you need, and of course that you secure that information in the very best way possible. So only collect, for example, if you're only going to use name and phone number or name and email address, which many of you would need to provide an extra mechanism to collect email address if it's not on your voter registration form. There is no need for you to collect and keep any private information of young people, like their driver's license number or social security. So we would suggest not collecting that or redacting that from any records that you're keeping. The pledge card, I'm going to show you in a minute, is something that many leagues are using, or simply a sign-up sheet at your event. If you're doing a sign-up sheet, please actually pass it around and be encouraging to get people to sign up. Again, it helps the voters and it helps us get the word out about our great work to get as many sign-ups as possible. So that's an easy way for the young people to volunteer their information to you. And if you feel the need to explain why you're collecting their information, we recommend keeping it simple, positive, non-apologetic. We're helping empower you to vote. We're going to follow up in a few months when Election Day is coming and provide you some information that you need, whether it's, again, for the primary, for the general, hopefully for both, or even for next year's election. Now, here's what a pledge card looks like. You're welcome to use something like this and put it on every student's desk along with the form. Some leagues have even developed little sticky notes that has this information and put them on the forms so that students can quickly give you their name and email address or cell phone number if you're doing a texting service. And if you're interested in hearing more about how leagues are experimenting with texting for these, I have a list of leagues who are doing this successfully. If you'd like to talk to a local league doing texting to follow up with young voters, email works too. So here's a sample of what a pledge card could look like, just a little slip of paper. And again, this is in the training manual. And then, of course, in terms of what kind of follow-up, and I realize we are getting very close to the end of our hour, close to Election Day works best, whether it's the primary or the general election, or again, hopefully both. Voters start to think about Election Day much closer to Election Day itself than maybe we are. So sending out that follow-up a couple times, but close to Election Day, being personal. So, dear Sarah, thanks so much for registering to vote with us. Maybe you can even set up a little phone bank of your volunteers, or certainly an email bank. You registered to vote with us back in March. We just wanted to make sure you saw our voter guide, make sure you're ready to vote in November. Here's where you can go to find your polling place, et cetera, et cetera. Ask them to think about or share. Are they going to go vote before school, after school? If they've gone on to college since you helped them register, have they requested an absentee ballot or re-registered in their new residency? Links to where they can go do that, etc. And we have some great scripts for how to talk about this, and they're also in the training manual to help you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel on following up. I'm going to quickly talk about visibility. Again, we hope that you'll tell the media in your area a little bit about what you're doing, because it's so impressive and it's a great feel-good story and important. So it's when you're talking to the media, and we have some sample media materials in the training manual. How many folks did you register? Why was this important to your league? What do other voters listening need to know about upcoming elections? Photos are great for this, and asking folks to volunteer with the league. So if people like what they see, if they're interested in registering voters, here's how they can get involved with your league. And again, I can help one-on-one with anything media related if you have questions or need help. Quickly, fundraising. I know that our grants did not cover all of your costs in some cases, because we wanted to support as many leagues as possible. So many leagues have had success raising some additional money by asking individuals, whether they're league members or individual small business owners in your community, or other kind of prominent folks, to give some money. You can ask specifically that people support your high school voter registration program. And being as specific as possible tends to be really helpful. So if a $100 donation will help pay for X number of new voter registration posters for you, or will enable you to print X number more voter guides to give out to the students next time you visit the school, or give you this many buttons, or let you go to 2 more schools, or cover the costs of 3 more volunteers to attend a school registration event. Being a little creative and being really tangible, and asking for small amounts of money, depending on who you're asking, of course, can really help you be successful in raising those extra funds. And again, there are some resources on this in the training manual. So finally, if you haven't gathered already, please use the training manual. And if there's not something in there, ask me, and chances are we have something, or we'll come up with something to help you. Ask me for help. If you're struggling at all, if you're having a problem meeting the requirements of the grant, I'd really rather know sooner than later so that we can work it out and so that I can support you, hopefully. And so please let me know if you're having a challenge and we can talk it through, or I will connect you to a league that has maybe gone through a similar struggle. Send photos of your work so that we can use them and give you great credit for the important work you're doing. And then, as you know from your contracts, you'll have a final report due to me at the end of June in order to get your final grant installment. And we'll send out all the information about that as we get closer to that. So I know that a few folks have asked questions, and I'm going to take a look at that right now. But also, if you have a question you'd like to ask on the phone, please raise your hand, and we'll open up for a few minutes of questions. And if you have to go, I understand, and thank you for your time. I know we've reached the end of our hour, too. So I'm going to look at the questions. Let's see. So Eileen asks, information for doing online registration of volunteers. Oh, I will certainly look into that, Eileen, to see what my own league is using. Volunteer sign up. I've made a note, Eileen, sure thing. So, Hope says, thank you. This was a great webinar. I appreciate that, Hope. Let's see. Jamie says, for students who aren't old enough to register, can the league ask if they want to sign up for a text alert or email when they are old enough? That's a great idea, Jamie, and absolutely you can. Go for it. That's a wonderful idea. Linda asks, should we send reminders to vote for 2018 primary and for November? And yeah, Linda, I would say do both if you can. Absolutely. And again, if you've collected the information once, you've already done most of the work to do that. Okay, let's see. Eileen says they give every student some basic a bookmark or whatever mentioning Vote 411. Again, that's right. If you're already doing the work and making the investment to put your voter guide on Vote 411, please tell the students that and make sure they can access that and have information. So that's great. All right, Anna, you ask about texting. I will follow up with you, Anna, with some information for leagues who are using texting, because some leagues are really successfully doing that for the first time, really. Let's see. Gail asks about the training manual. It's about 10 years old. Yeah, so I'm going to send out a more up-to-date training manual, Gail. I think we last updated it 2 years ago. So I'll be emailing out the most up-to-date version after the call today. All right, well, thank you, everybody. It looks like everyone is saying Joyce is also interested in texting. Okay. I'm making a note. All right, I'm just going to see if anyone else raised their hand. Let's see. Mary, did you have a question now? I've unmuted your line, Mary, if you had a question.
Yes. Can we hold a drawing at each site? So anybody who wants to put their name in a bowl, and we draw the name and give away a T-shirt or something?
Yeah, I know leagues have done that kind of thing. Again, I would just make sure that the school is okay with that and that sort of thing. But that should be absolutely fine. Again, as long as anyone would be able to put their name in, regardless of whether or not they registered to vote with you.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And one other question, and I probably have to follow up with you, but some states allow you to pre-register, and I'm not sure if Ohio allows that or not.
I'm not sure, but yeah, sure. If you can shoot me an email, we can certainly figure that out together.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I know there's a few other questions in the chat box that I will go through, but we are 5 minutes over, so I'm going to go ahead and end things with that. I really appreciate everyone's time. I'm always available to you, and I just thank you, and I'm very excited to work with all of you. So have a great day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.